we have been able to get hold of Professor Noam Chomsky, and so he will be joining us during the course of the next hour. Noam Chomsky was born in December of 1928 in Philadelphia. He received his Ph.D. in linguistics in 1955 from the University of Pennsylvania. He joined the staff of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1955. Professor Chomsky has received a variety of honorary degrees and has won numerous prizes for his work. What work? Well, as a linguist, he has proposed a theory of transformational generative grammar, which attracted widespread interest because of the claims it made about the relationship between language and the mind and the universality of an underlying language structure. According to a New York Times article, the New York Times being a paper that Noam Chomsky begrudgingly says he reads every day, quoting here, Chomsky's introduction of his theory of language in 1957, often called the Chomsky Revolution, has been equated with Darwin's theory of evolution and Freud's theory of the unconscious in terms of its importance in the history of ideas. It was the first concerted approach to investigating the human mind through systematic study of how people produce and understand sentences. Noam Chomsky is known outside of the academy because of his criticisms of imperialist tendencies in the U.S. government and his outspoken social criticism of the media and corporate America. Today we're happy to welcome Professor Noam Chomsky on behalf of the many listeners who for years have been requesting his presence. Professor Chomsky, welcome.
Glad to be with you.
Glad you could join us. He joins us by phone from his office at MIT. You can join the conversation with Noam Chomsky by calling 1-800-433-8850. You can email us at pi@wamu.org. Is there any issue, Professor Chomsky, that you think is particularly compelling at the moment that you'd like to discuss, that you believe the media are not covering well or ignoring? I know that's a bit of an open-ended question, but I didn't want to go the whole hour without asking you what's on your mind.
Well, you can start with the lead story in this morning's New York Times, for example, just to pick one at random. That's on the congressional House approval of the Clinton administration request for roughly $1.5 billion for Colombia.
Yep.
The headline says that it is an effort to fight the drug war, and that's the main thrust of the story, until you get to the last paragraph, and skilled readers of newspapers know that that's a good place to start from, usually.
The last paragraph.
Yeah, and in the last, near the end, it's pointed out that this really doesn't have much to do with the drug war. If you want to deal with the drugs as a problem, to the extent that it is a problem in the United States, and if you want to deal with it, you deal with it through remedial programs, treatment, prevention of the conditions that lead to it, and so on. And this, while it makes a gesture at that, doesn't deal with it. What it does deal with is Colombia, which, incidentally, you might ask exactly what right we have to carry out military activity and chemical and biological warfare, which is, in fact, what we're doing in Colombia to eradicate a crop that the U.S. government says it doesn't like. I mean, for example, does China have the right to carry out the chemical and biological warfare in North Carolina to eradicate a highly lethal crop, which, in fact, the Supreme Court has really recently described as the greatest health hazard in the United States, which is causing millions of deaths in China and Asia, and where they are compelled, incidentally, to take advertising by U.S. firms directed at vulnerable populations like women and children in order to increase the sales of this lethal drug. Does that, namely tobacco, far beyond the effects of cocaine? Do they have the right to carry out such activities in North Carolina? Well, no, we wouldn't say so.
Well, Professor Chomsky, would legality be the issue there? Your opponents would argue that tobacco is legal in China, cocaine is not in the United States.
Well, makes no difference. Suppose that they declare it illegal. In fact, the countries of East Asia, South Korea, Thailand, and others, have tried to block advertising They haven't tried to make it illegal, but they've tried to block access to, let's say, advertising directed to the general population, including vulnerable sectors, to increase the use of this lethal drug. And they were threatened by severe trade sanctions by the United States to prevent them from doing that. Actually, that happened at exactly the same moment, same month, that George Bush declared the drug war. It wasn't reported, but should have been. So it's not a question of legality. I mean, in fact, if they were to declare it illegal, say, in Thailand or China, that wouldn't give them the right to carry out experiments with chemical and biological weapons in North Carolina, or to send helicopters and so on. It doesn't matter what they declare. So one question is, what right do we have to do anything in Colombia? Another question is exactly what is this money for? Is it for fighting the drug war? Is it for eradicating drugs? Well, if so, you would think it would be targeting drug producers, and it's not. So among the major drug producers in Colombia are the paramilitary forces closely linked to the military, who even the State Department agrees are responsible for the overwhelming mass of the atrocities, which are huge. And they're all up to their necks in narco trafficking. The war is not aimed at them. In fact, it excludes them. In fact, the military aid is going to them. It's aimed at peasants in an area who have been driven to coca production for interesting reasons, which is worth looking at, but who are producing coca and are in an area which happens to have been under guerrilla control for many years. That's where it's going. Is that a drug war?
It would appear your argument is that this is really a war against the guerrillas whom the government is fighting. Yeah. The government is fighting. I had a conversation with Secretary of State Madeleine Albright earlier this week. She's citing Colombia as one of the 4 countries in the world that the U.S. sees as a priority to discuss another aspect of the war on drugs. Colombia apparently has become the center of production because Peru and Bolivia at this point are not the center of production. Is there any doubt in your mind at all that if U.S. policies in Colombia are successful, then we will simply see an increase of production of coca in Peru and Bolivia once again, and that this dance, this merry-go-round, will simply continue?
Not only is that my opinion, but it's the opinion of just about every specialist on the topic. Yes, of course, that'll happen. So, for example, if the U.S. succeeds in its aim, which I doubt, of destroying the guerrilla movement, the peasants should just move deeper into the countryside. We might ask why they're producing coca. For example, why aren't they producing coffee, say, or other commercial products? Well, there are reasons for that. And you can read about them in standard international economics texts, like Susan Strange's last book, a well-known political economist at London. The reason is that there are many reasons, but one of them is that about 30 years ago, when third world countries, the so-called Group of 77, that means basically the non-aligned countries, the large majority of the population of the world, attempted to develop what was called a new international economic order. This was through the agency of UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development, which was established for that purpose, which would provide opportunities for development and growth in a constructive fashion in most of the world. And one of the things they called for, one of the first things they called for, was efforts to stabilize commodity prices. Now, internal to the United States or internal to the European countries, commodity prices are relatively stabilized. So for example, this year, farm production is going to be, prices are going way down, so the government will come in and give subsidies to maintain a certain level for the farming interest in the United States, and things like that are done within every developed country. The underdeveloped countries were calling for it internationally, and for them it's extremely important. If commodity prices, say coffee is the biggest commodity in international exchange after oil, it's not a small thing. If, say, coffee prices oscillate wildly, that doesn't affect agribusiness very much. So a big corporation can tolerate losses one year in one of its areas of production, then just make it up elsewhere and go on. but it very seriously affects small producers. If you're a peasant producing, say, coffee, and the prices go down below the subsistence level, you can't tell your children, don't bother eating this year, I'll feed you next year. So you get out of the business. And in fact, it's well known that one of this effort was blocked by the United States primarily, would not permit stabilization of prices. And in fact, the whole effort of a new international economic order was destroyed. And this is one reason why peasants have to look for something else. There are other reasons. Colombia used to be a wheat producer, big wheat producer. In the 1950s, it was submerged by Food for Peace Aid, as it was called. Well, you know, Food for Peace Aid is a kind of a mixed story, but one part of it was essentially public subsidy to U.S. agribusiness. And the effect in Colombia was to wipe out wheat production. Okay, that's another source that's out. And if you look over the record, you find there are many reasons why, in fact, the same is true throughout the Andean region. The United States primarily, the whole international economic system of the rich, but it's primarily the U.S., is imposing a kind of a regime on the third world in which they are to open up their markets to subsidized U.S. exports, like agro-exports, which will, of course, wipe out small production. And then they are to turn to agro-export. Well, when you impose those policies, what happens? It's easy to predict. They'll move to the things that they can sell on the market.
And the coca plant, which produces cocaine, is what they ultimately can sell on the market.
Yeah.
Allow me to take a telephone call on the subject of, no, I'm sorry, I thought this was on Colombia, but it's on Cambodia. I'll get to Monroe in Japan very shortly. But I wanted to follow up on that to ask what you would advocate as a more reasoned policy towards Colombia.
Towards Colombia? Well, there is something constructive going on in Colombia now. Colombia has a whole, the United States is not the whole story in Colombia's problems. There's a lot of problems, go way back. And it's been a very violent country with a tremendous brutality and oppression and an extremely ugly socioeconomic system, a potentially rich country with a huge amount of starvation and poverty that shouldn't be there, and that's one of the reasons for the guerrilla movements. In the last couple of months, there have been positive steps. The government and the guerrillas have been meeting. They're undertaking some kind of negotiations. As you know, they were recently in Sweden to basically to look at a more progressive socioeconomic system to see if it had any lessons for them to learn. These are positive developments. Now, you know, it's not utopia, but the proper approach to Colombia, in my opinion, would be to support these measures. The military aid that's going in under the cover of a drug war is going to undermine them.
Welcome back. Our guest on this hour of Public Interest is Massachusetts Institute of Technology Linguistics Professor Noam Chomsky. He joins us from his office at MIT. You can join us too. Just call 1-800-433-8850 or email us at pi@wamu.org. Professor Chomsky, a number of listeners are already joining us. I suspect my time for questions is running out real quickly, but I noticed that on your 1998 CD, Propaganda and Control of the Public Mind, one of the things you talked about was the history of the U.S. relationship with Cuba, which obviously comes to mind right now as we look at the tug-of-war going on between the United States, well, in particularly the exiled Cuban community in Miami, the INS, and the government of Cuba over the future of Elian Gonzalez. Your take on this, please.
On the Elian Gonzalez case,
yes,
or on
please.
the relations to Cuba?
On the Elian Gonzalez case.
Well, on the Elian Gonzalez case, I happen to agree with the U.S. government. He should immediately have been returned to his father. And the longer it's dragged out, the more traumatic it's going to be for him. If he stays long enough, that's the hope of the people around him. He's a 6-year-old kid, you know, moving into a rich country where he's being given everything he likes. No question, he'll be utterly confused and he'll forget where he grew up. But we should, there's a series of other similar cases right at the same period, and the children have, of course, been returned to their parents. Exactly, it should happen. What's the reason for this? Well, here we have to ask serious questions, and that goes back to what you said. What's the reason for U.S. hostility towards Cuba. Now, in fact, the answers to that question are known. And in my opinion, they ought to be front-page headlines in all the newspapers ever since they had been known. They've been declassified. We know exactly what the thinking was of the Eisenhower and the early Kennedy administrations when they launched what, in fact, is a war against Cuba. So I'll quote it. When the Kennedy administration came in, it was going to focus on Latin America. It had a Latin American mission. It was headed by well-known historian Arthur Schlesinger. He presented the report of the mission to the President Kennedy, who had not yet come into office, and he described Cuba, of course. He said the threat of Cuba is what he called the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, an idea which has great appeal to many impoverished people throughout Latin America who face similar problems and might be stimulated by the Cuban example. That's the threat of Cuba. It's not unique. That's rather common. And I think that should be known. There's plenty more like that, which I can add to it, but that's the basic story.
Okay, thank you for answering that question. There are some of our listeners who want us to get off of politics and onto linguistics, and in particular, their theory of the universality of grammar. But allow me to have Nigel in Baltimore, Maryland, put that question to you himself. Nigel, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
Fine.
Chomsky.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, right. Now the question, as I would try to phrase it as clearly, right? Is the ancient roots of our language something that has kind of evolved from apes to humans, and then in humans it came out as how we speak, and in apes it came out in their own sort of speaking, or is it something has completely difference between apes and humans? And I will hang up and hear it on the
Well, to be clear, contemporary humans are not evolved from apes. Humans and apes all evolved from they have a common origin, maybe on the order of 7 million years ago, and what ultimately became humans developed on one path, along with many other species, all of which, in fact, have terminated. They're not around anymore. And many species of monkeys and apes developed along another path. So the evolutionary distance between us and, say, contemporary apes, remember, they all kept evolving. So apes are not what they were 7 million years ago, and we're not what we were 7 million years ago. That means there's roughly on the order of 10 to 15 million years of evolutionary distance between humans and contemporary primates, other apes and monkeys. The development of language in humans, as far as anyone knows, is extremely recent, maybe on the order of 100,000 or maybe 200,000 years ago, which in evolutionary time is absolutely nothing. It's a flick of an eye. Furthermore, it seems that it's from a very small breeding group. Humans have extremely little genetic diversity. It's recently been discovered. As compared with, say, chimpanzees, the diversity among humans is very small, so small that it's generally assumed now that there must have been quite a small breeding group of maybe 2 tens of thousands of people, maybe a couple 100,000 years ago, from whom all of us have that's our origin of the surviving humans. There are many other similar species around at the time, but they've died off. With regard to apes, there are many more varieties. But what happened in the last couple 100,000 years of the evolution of humans has almost nothing to do with what's been happening for 7 million years with apes. And the systems that evolved just don't have any relationship at all. So, for example, vervet monkeys, one that have been studied well, have, I think, 5 calls. There's one call if you see an eagle, and another call if you see a snake, and so on. That's not the way human language works. In fact, human language just doesn't even fit in the general taxonomies of comparative communication that have been developed, and they're interesting by animal by the comparative biologists. It's a very special system, which we don't really see any analog to, let alone homologous structures similar.
Okay, Nigel, thank you very much for your call. Allow us to move on to Monroe in Komaki, Japan. Monroe, thank you for waiting. You're on the air.
Well, thank you so much. Excuse me, Coach. Mr. Nan, I would appreciate your leeway in this. Mr. Chomsky has been I've been very fascinated by Mr. Chomsky's words, the professor here. Professor, good heavens, sir. When I look at like I live in Japan right now. I'm an English teacher in Japan, and well, good heavens. I live in Asia, and well, what I understand the relationship of the United States and Southeast Asia, about 30 some odd years ago, there's this particular thing that really strikes out and hits me right in the face.
Well, Monroe, you're gonna have to get your question out because there are a whole lot of people waiting
I hear
to
you,
talk
boss.
with Noam Chomsky.
Okay, now look. Okay, the Cambodian communists made an alliance with the Vietnamese communists back in the 50s. Okay, there's a lot of Vietnamese cadres assigned to Cambodia, and after Lon Nol took control of Cambodia, Pol Pot, for whatever reason, decided to send human waves of Vietnamese cadres against Phnom Penh to take Phnom Penh. At the same time, we were bombing the place to smithereens. Now, the problem is the United States is only bombing Vietnamese cadres. We never touched the Khmer Rouge.
No, that's not true.
Well, no, that is
totally
quite
false.
true, sir. That is quite true.
No, it's totally false. I mean, the bombing was mostly aimed. They were not Vietnamese cadres being sent. These were Cambodians, and the United States was bombing inner Cambodia. There's no controversy about that.
Fault on Phnom Penh. We were only bombing Vietnamese cadres.
Look, just take a look at the scholarly literature or U.S. intelligence. Nobody believes that.
Okay, Monroe, I don't think we're going to be able to continue because this dialogue may just absolutely take too much time, and a number of our callers would like to get to other issues. Let's go to Brian in Arlington, Virginia. Brian, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Kojo. Professor Chomsky, thank you. Your writing's been profoundly influential to myself and many of my peers. My question is, do you believe that the public discomfort with the so-called free trade organizations like the WTO and the IMF, as displayed in Seattle, is having an effect on the priorities of transnational capital? And if so, why now? And if not, what steps can be taken to exert more pressure?
Oh, it's certainly having pressure. So, for example, just a year before the Seattle protests, public pressure around the world compelled the OECD, the organization of the roughly 30 rich countries, to back down on an effort that they were making to pass something called a multilateral agreement on investments, which would have been a tremendous investor rights agreement that the public, it was kept essentially quiet for a long time, was known but not publicized. As soon as the facts leaked out, enormous public protests developed all over the world, and they were forced to back down. Seattle was similar. It was another case of the same kind. There's a lot of opposition to the particular form of globalization. It's not globalization. It's a particular form of globalization in the interests of corporations and investors that's being foisted on the world. There's opposition to it from Indian peasants to American workers, substantial opposition, and it's taking many forms. And it's certainly shaping the agenda of those who are trying to press those programs. It's shaping their public relations, for one thing. But it's also making it harder for them to implement specific plans that they have worked out essentially in secret and are trying to impose, and that as soon as they hit the light of day, they arouse enormous public protest. And they know it. They know that the public is opposed. So, for example, when one of these proposals, fast track, couple of years ago was blocked by Congress. The Wall Street Journal had an interesting article in which they said, every sane person should be in favor of this, although the public's against it. But the opponents, they said, have an ultimate weapon, namely the public is opposed. And it hasn't been easy yet to figure out how to deal with that ultimate weapon. Whenever you try to keep it secret, try to keep it out of the public eye, and so on. But these are, we live in a relatively free society. These things leak out. And when they leak out, public opposition increases. And it's strong. You can, and for good reasons, in my opinion. Not all the reasons are good, but some of them are very sound. And I think that the opposition will grow. There'll be more of it in Washington next week. And it will surely shape the efforts of concentrated private power. It'll affect their efforts to try to gain more and more control over international society.
Professor Noam Chomsky is talking to us from his office at MIT. His reference to more of it in Washington next week has to do with protests that are expected here in Washington at a meeting of the World Bank. Is that right, Professor
Correct,
Chomsky?
yeah.
This is Public Interest. I'm Kojo Nnamdi. Okay, let's move on to Jim, who is in South Bend, Indiana. Jim, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you, Kojo. Professor, I have a question and somewhat of a comment, and I'll take my answer off the air. I write for a paper here in the Midwest, and I write on many political topics, and one of them that has been of interest has been the drug problem throughout the world. It appears to me that having especially in the Colombian theater down there, having a drug problem is good business. And what I'm trying to say is that the military complex that we're supporting financially with not knowing where our dollars are going, it may just be good business to have a drug problem. You have to look at the amount of money that they're bringing in from the American public to fight a drug problem that they really don't seem to be making any headway in. They make token headway in order to gain more money. I think the same situation may be applying to Thailand and other places where you have imports of drugs coming in, but you also seem to have a relatively strong military presence that is incapable of doing it without U.S. dollars coming in. So I have to take the opinion that, like I say, it may be just good business to have a drug problem to get U.S. foreign aid, and I'd like your opinion on that.
Thank you, Jim.
Well, if you take a look at who's lobbying in favor of the Colombia bill, you get a partial answer to that. The helicopter manufacturers, for example, have been lobbying very hard. And in fact, the military producers, who are essentially publicly subsidized private industries, they've been lobbying very hard to get this bill passed. The U.S., as perhaps you know, I'm sure you know, is the leading military exporter in the world, much of it to very ugly regimes, and there's tremendous support for that on the part of military industry. And we should remember that military industry means high-tech industry. They're very closely integrated. It's hard to separate them. So yes, there's a significant sector of the U.S. industrial system, manufacturing and industrial system, that's strongly supportive of these operations. And not just that, financial institutions as well. So, drug money is illegal, so nobody has exact figures. But the rough estimates are by UN and other monitors that probably about half of the narco money passes through U.S. banks, and that goes somewhere. So there's plenty of interest in it. I mean, myself, I don't think that's the main factor that's pushing it, but yes, that is an interest. If you are looking at economic interest, there's plenty of others. The United States has an incredible incarceration rate, way beyond any other industrial society. That's only in the last 20 years. You go back 20 years, the United States was more or less like other industrial societies in the proportion of people in prison. But during the Reagan years, it increased very fast, roughly tripled, and it continuing at the same astonishing rate. There's now more than 2 million in jail. If you look at who's in jail, it's becoming primarily really victimless crimes, people possession, drug-related crimes, often without victims. And in fact, the drug war here domestically is focusing on what it's turning out to be, and I think was planned to be, most criminologists believe was planned to be, essentially a war against minorities. In fact, when the drug war was called back about 10 or 15 years ago, Senator Moynihan, who's one of the few senators who pays attention to social statistics and that sort of thing, he pointed out, look, he said, if we pass this, we're determining to declare a crime wave among minorities. And that's the way it was shaped. Well, the huge incarceration rate carries enormous economic benefits. This is one of the growth industries in the United States, not just construction, but even big financial firms like, say, Merrill Lynch and others who are floating loans for prison construction, private prisons. It's not on the scale of the Pentagon or the military-industrial system, but it's a very, by now, substantial piece of the economy, and it largely feeds off the drug war, which also works as a technique of social control. So there are a lot of factors involved, but and the one you point to is undoubtedly one of them.
Talking with Professor Noam Chomsky in his office at MIT. Professor Chomsky, the presidential campaign is underway. We know the two major party candidates, Al Gore and George W. Bush. We know that the Reform Party is having a variety of internal problems. We know that Ralph Nader is running with the Green Party. But I'm interested in your view of exactly how language, if you will, affects the public perception of who's viable, who's not viable, who's legitimate, who's not legitimate, who's a real candidate, and who's not.
Well, of course, language is the modality in which candidates and their public relations managers and so on reach the public. So naturally, language is involved. And the messages are shaped very consciously in order to try to, first of all, to interest the public, which is for the most part not interested. We have very low voting participation, to try to get the public involved in one fashion or another, and then to shift them one way or another among the major candidates. And the major candidates are typically very slightly different, if at all. One of the reasons for the lack of public interest. But it's hard to point to language as a specific phenomenon. It's just the modality in which people are approached. One of them. I mean, there's other kinds of television imagery and so on.
Okay, let's go back to the telephones with BJ in Tempe, Arizona. BJ, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
And Mr. Chomsky, I have to say thank you very much for bringing Colombia into the spotlight. And my question to you is simple. What is the end game? I mean, how do you see this being resolved? My father is Colombian, and I know quite a lot about the situation, and I just, at times, can't wrap my mind around it. It is business. For example, the Skorsky UH-60L Black Hawk, each one, I guess, costs millions. I know there's a contract for about $400 million, and that's United Technologies. That's a company based in Connecticut. So there's that whole dynamic, like the caller before on the cell phone in the car said, it is business. But also, there's the tie-in with the political culture of violence in Colombia. And these past 50 years in Colombia are referred to in Spanish, and you're, the linguist of the ages, I mean, la violencia, the violence. We don't even see it as left or right, government or rebel. It's all equal, and it's one of violence. And in a way, these rebel groups are legitimate in the sense that, at least they're speaking for someone. So I ask you, what is the end game?
Yeah. Well, actually, the history of Colombia, you're right, it's a very violent history. In fact, it goes back before that. At the turn of the century, beginning of the 19th century, there was a huge war in Colombia where, I've forgotten, maybe 100,000 people were killed. And it's been very violent ever since. The violence is rooted in the hopeless inequality and oppressiveness of the internal society. Colombia is a very rich country, potentially, plenty of resources. I mean, much of the country has never been under the control of the government. It's a huge country. There aren't even roads in many places, but there's enormous resources, enormous wealth, and it's very highly concentrated. There's an enormous amount of poverty and a lot starvation. And of course, this constantly breeds conflict. Marulanda, who's the sort of legendary head of FARC, is a peasant who came out of peasant struggles back in the 50s. And you're right. I mean, the groups that he represents and came out of, they have a legitimate, some kind of, whatever one thinks of them, they have a basis in the country which is based on serious oppression and injustice. And as long as that remains, there's going to be violence. Now, it happens that the U.S. involvement of this has been harmful, very harmful. Didn't have to be, but it was. And that goes back primarily to the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration was involved in counterinsurgency, kind of a militaristic approach to many of the similar problems throughout Latin America, in Colombia in particular. This is well known. So if you read, say, Vasquez Carriosa, you probably know the head of the Permanent Human Rights Commission and a very respected Colombian figure. He points out, yes, all of this violence is endemic to Colombia and has to do with its nature and its history and so on, but it was made much worse by the Kennedy administration. They sent a military mission to Colombia back in around 1962, headed by Colonel Yarborough, Special Forces, and they made proposals to the Colombian military, including, this is virtually a quote, proposals to carry out a military and paramilitary terror against known communist adherents. Now, that term does not mean communists. That means union leaders, peasant organizers, priests, human rights activists, anyone who the authorities decide to call communists. And they should carry out terror, a term that was used by paramilitaries who were carrying out most of the terror, organized by the military against these people. Well, that changed the character of the war, the fighting, and it stayed that way. Throughout the 1990s, Colombia has had the worst human rights record in the Western Hemisphere, and it's been the leading recipient of U.S. military aid and training. You mentioned, Kojo, before that Colombia, I think you or somebody mentioned, that Colombia is now the third leading recipient of U.S. military aid. The first two, Egypt and Israel, are in a different category, totally. So it's actually the top recipient. It replaced Turkey, which was the top recipient. The reason is that Turkey was fighting a brutal and murderous war against its Kurdish population, some of the worst ethnic cleansing and atrocities of the 1990s. And it was being funded by the Clinton administration, which poured in arms as the atrocities got worse. But Turkey managed to more or less suppress its internal uprising of Kurds. So therefore, Colombia is moving into first place because it hasn't suppressed its yet. Unfortunately, that's the history of U.S. military aid and training. It's not just helicopters, as you say. That's a factor. I don't think it's a major factor. But yes, there are direct business interests, but it's much more general. It has to do with ensuring that these regions remain under the in a framework in which their resources are essentially accessible to U.S.-based corporations. That's basically what it amounts to. And that means retaining inegalitarian, unjust societies which are constantly breeding violence.
Okay, thank you for your call, BJ. Moving along to Anya in Washington, D.C. Anya, your turn.
Good afternoon, Kojo. That is Anya.
Anya.
Let me first admit that although I have heard the name Noam Chomsky, I haven't had the time to actually review or read up on any of his works. But I will say that I am impressed by his perspective and views today. My question is have whether or not your guest has had the opportunity to look at a close relationship between the language of a West African group known as the Igbo people and the Japanese language. It's very similar. There are a great many words that not only are pronounced the same and spelled the same, but actually have the same meaning. And the names, both first and last, are very similar. And if this has never been brought to his attention, I'd like to know whether or not he could at least speculate on how something like this could occur.
Well, first, let me just say right off, I know absolutely nothing about it, no more than you do, probably less. However, I think you should be extremely skeptical about such claims. I mean, it is well known that if you take any two languages you look at them, you can find what look like parallels. The reason is there just aren't that many options. So just at random, you're going to find parallels. And those don't mean anything. In order to find, there's a well-developed science of reconstructing language origins and connections. And it requires systematic correspondences of a very specific type. And I'm confident that if you look at Igbo and Japanese, you're not going to find this.
Okay, Anya, thank you for your call. James in Wingate, North Carolina, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
With this speaker, in terms of drugs being a war on minorities, Samuel Yet said that some years ago when he was tracing the role of the CIA. It removes, of course, many minority males from society and leaves many African-American females with limited choices of mates. And with a criminal record, their ability to make a living legally or to vote has been substantially eradicated. I agree, and we've spent 80 years trying to deal with drugs unsuccessfully. We only spent 13 years dealing with prohibition. I'm a sociologist. I agree with Nadelman and Jay Gould in terms of the benefits to legalize drugs. It doesn't mean you endorse it, but it means you realize that you can't stop people from doing what they want to do. Some of the benefits are removes the criminal element. It stops making criminals out of otherwise decent people. It ensures a safer product. It reduces substantially the cost of drugs. It reduces the money we have to pay border guards to parole the borders. It gets rid of...
Your point, James?
Point is, I'm agreeing with him, and I'm endorsing the legalization of drugs, and I know you're...
Yeah. This is Public Interest. I'm Kojo Nnamdi. Noam Chomsky, care to respond to that?
Well, I think that that's definitely an option that ought to be considered quite seriously. Exactly what ought to be done is a complicated issue, but the option of legalization is one that ought to be pursued. Certainly, mostly for what are called soft drugs like marijuana. Exactly how to do it is one should be careful. You know, there are a lot of unforeseen consequences when you carry out any social change. But I basically agree with the thrust of your comment. I think that's a direction to move in. The right way to deal with drugs, in my opinion, is exactly the way that tobacco has been dealt with. It's through educational programs, through treatment, remedies, and so on. And that's the way to overcome lethal substances. Tobacco is the most lethal among the drugs by a long shot. Making it criminal wouldn't have helped, but educational programs have helped substantially. I mean, I haven't seen a student, say, at a college smoking a cigarette for many years. Study after study has shown that remedial programs and prevention programs and educational programs are far more effective than criminalization by a huge factor in dealing with drug problems. And even deeper than that is the causes. I mean, why do you have people turning to drugs? It's not. It's because of conditions. To a large extent, it's because of the conditions in which they live, the circumstances of their lives, and so on. They have other opportunities, other possibilities. You'll find it reducing. These are the ways to approach the problem, not by criminalization and not by bombing peasants.
We got an email from Tajana Kuick in Elkhart, Indiana, which says, Professor Chomsky has written a great deal about the Balkans. I extremely respect his insights. Would you please comment on the recent development of events in Kosovo?
Well, Kosovo is now returning to something like what it was in the 1980s when, if you read back at the New York Times happened to have a very good correspondent there in the 1980s, David Binder. He's still writing about it. And what he was describing was severe repression at that time against Serbs by the Albanian majority. And it's essentially now returning to that under except this time with 40,000 NATO troops, mostly NATO troops on the ground. It's not as bad as it was last April. Let's say last April was a horror story. And now it's ugly, but not that kind of horror story. But bear in mind that the horror story came after the U.S. bombing, the NATO bombing. Before that, it wasn't very pleasant by any means. In fact, it was kind of like Colombia in many ways. But the bombing made it much, much worse. It really caused a humanitarian catastrophe. Well, that particular humanitarian catastrophe, which was the result of the bombing, has now been declined, and another humanitarian catastrophe developed, smaller but real. And that's what it is now. Also, if anybody's interested in drugs, it happens to be a center of drug production by now. Also, and drug transit, as is pretty well known.
Professor Noam Chomsky, I'm afraid we are out of time. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll certainly try to have you join us on Public Interest again. We were able to get this interview with Professor Noam Chomsky with the help of two people in the linguistics department at the University of Maryland, Cleanthus Groman and Professor Norman Hornstein. We would like to thank them for their help. We'd like to thank all of you who joined us for listening. And once again, Professor Chomsky, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be with you.